Thanks all. It's nice to see you all. Welcome to this evening's Institute of Historical Research, Transport and Mobility History seminar. My name is Mike Esbester. I'm one of the co-conveners. Charlotte Matheson is doing the tech this evening for us. Thanks, Charlotte. And I will introduce our speaker, Alex Popple, in a moment. It's nice to have lots of you along. Before we get started, just to say that the next seminar in the series will be on the 25th of April, so there's a bit of a gap, and that will be a Meet the Archivist session, and it will be a bit of a double header, as we'll have a colleague from the Modern Record Centre at the University of Warwick and Neil Carter from De Montfort University talking about the National Cycling Archive. And we'll go into a bit more detail about that in April, but we'll get the booking link open for that and registration open for that as soon as possible. We're just confirming the final details on that. There's also something else coming up on the 9th of May, which hasn't yet been advertised, because again, we've just had the okay to do this and we're just getting things set up. This will be an in-person session at Aston University, aimed at PhD students in particular. So we've realised for some time that there are an increasing number of PhD students working on transport and mobility history topics, and more broadly than that, transport and mobility topics. We thought it would be beneficial to try to get people together to meet each other, to find out about each other and what they're doing, and build a bit more of the community. So we've been fortunate, we've received some extra funding from the IHR to do that. We are going to launch a call for contributions shortly. It's going to have quite a tight deadline on it, so it'll be a deadline in early March. We're just getting that finalised. And again, to then come to the event in Aston on the 9th of May. So keep an eye out for that, please. We will send notice around, particularly via the usual sorts of email routes. So the Transport History JISC mail list, which Charlotte's just put in the chat, and the Railway Studies JISC mail list, which Charlotte's just put in the chat. So if you're not already subscribed to those lists, do please sign up for more details. And keep your eyes peeled, because we'll promote it as much as possible, because we'd like to see you there. However, that's promo for the future done. Let's focus on tonight. Delighted to welcome Alex Popple along. Alex is an independent scholar with a standing interest in many different forms of transport and mobility. He is based in Cornwall, where he works in manufacturing as a digital services manager. He studied on the MA in Railway Studies at York, as was with David, and from which this evening's presentation is drawn. I'm quite lucky on this one, as the external examiner for the programme. I was fortunate to read people's work ahead of our getting this evening's preview on it, so I know what we've got tonight is going to be good. As you may be able to detect from the picture, he's based in Cornwall, and with a particular interest that has formed its way into the subject of tonight's paper, which is the GWR's role in the invention of the Cornish Riviera, distinction, serendipity and endurance. If I could ask everyone just to keep themselves muted during the presentation, and we will take questions at the end, whether they're asked verbally or in the chat. But Alex, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Mike, for that introduction and setup. And I, appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit more tonight and give this presentation, which is the first time doing it in this form. So definitely interested in feedback from people on what makes sense and anything that doesn't. And do feel free to give me those questions as we go through. So I'm going to now try to share my screen and make sure that's working. Okay, so is everybody seeing that? Yes, I'm going to take that as a yes. Not hearing
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, good. So yes, so as Mike mentioned, I'm going to talk about Cornish Riviera, which was the subject I chose for my dissertation topic when I was doing the Railway Studies MA. So I'll start by just saying a little bit about myself, which is I won't rest too long on this because it's partly a repetition of what Mike's just said in his introduction. But I'm not a full-time academic, and even when I was doing the railway studies, for those who don't know, that is a part-time course. But it was very nice to have the opportunity to do that, and allowed me to combine my interest in transport, long-standing interest in transport and railway history, with my local connection with Cornwall and thinking about the Riviera and what does it mean. And one of the things that I found was that it was one of those topics that always been around, always been part of the background for me. But when you start to think about the detail and think about where it came from and how it came about, what it means to you, it starts to get more and more interesting and nuanced. And I noticed that there was a lot of railway historiography, a lot of railway research on marketing in general had been done, but not much on individual campaigns and individual vehicles that the railways had used. So that was my starting point. So before I go any further, I always find it interesting to just ask people to think for a moment, what is the Cornish Riviera? Is it a term which is familiar to you? Does it mean anything to you? And I'd suggest, if anybody's got any, you might just want to think about it for yourself, or just put some thoughts into the chat, possibly. For anybody who doesn't know, the map is just showing where Cornwall is there in the very far southwest of the UK. Okay, so I'll start putting in some ideas of what the Cornish Riviera is. So it represents both tangible and intangible ideas. It represents tangible ideas in the sense of being a description of a geographical place. It's also a titled train, that Great Western service. It was a holiday guidebook, which the Great Western Railway published over many, many years. Example of that on the right-hand side of the screen there. And it was the marketing program that the Great Western indulged in to promote travel to the region. But it also has intangible qualities as a sort of destination brand, a heritage brand, a place identity, which is quite a soft idea, and a service brand. So there's hard and soft things going on here. How does it come about? Well, we have image making, a lot of image making by the Great Western Railway as to what the Riviera is and what it represents. And I'm just throwing up a few examples there. Left-hand side is one of the famous posters representing St. Michael's Mount. In the middle, we've got an illustration taken directly from the Cornish Riviera book. That's a 1920s Riviera, also used as a poster. So you can see again, and this is a sort of rather nondescript location. You don't know exactly where it is, but you're definitely being sold an idea here about what a Riviera looks like, and what are the characteristics of something like that. The palm trees suggesting that it's a warm area. You've got people in sophisticated summer outfits leaning up against the trees. You've got the boats in the harbour, and the pleasant evening sunshine. And then on the right hand side, you've got a photographic example of that from a slightly later period. That's 1930s. So you see there's definitely a move towards using photographic representations. But again, the same sort of ideas there. Again, you've got St. Michael's Mount in the middle. At the bottom, you've got a picture of Carbis Bay, which is near to St. Ives. Notice the palm trees in the foreground and the sands and the beach and the sunshine. And I've recently found this rather interesting quote that I've put in the middle there, which is from a House of Commons debate on advertising, 1914, in which the member says, the Great Western Railway has beguiled a very large number into believing they will find among the fishing villages on the Cornish coast perennial sun, sumptuous casinos with their attendant pleasures, turquoise blue seas, luxurious cooking, and other delights which I dare not name, which tells you how there was an awareness that this was an image being created by the Great Western, that this was something that was being created. However, the Great Western is not the only place that these ideas are coming from. And here are a couple of paintings produced quite independently by artists of the Newlyn School, contemporary with this particular period. For people who are familiar with art history, this was a well-known artist colony before St Ives really got going. And these people were promoting a particular vision of what Cornwall and rural life and seaside life was like. And there's a couple of paintings that I'm showing there. The right-hand side one by Lamorna Birch, one of the most famous artists of the area, who was, Lamorna is actually a nickname and is the village where he lived. And he's labelled that the Cornish Riviera. And again, you see the Mount's Bay there with St Michael's Mount in the middle ground. And on the left-hand side, you've got a picture by Frank Heath, Last Day of the Holiday. So that's not explicitly naming the Riviera, but you can see the same kind of ideas and thoughts coming in there. And this is definitely image making about what the area is like. So what I've found in my research is that there are three kind of themes that emerged for me, and that's these three things which you see on the screen here. So distinctiveness and difference, strategy and serendipity, and endurance and equivocation is the labels I came up for them. So the distinctiveness piece is that the Riviera as a campaign is really quite distinct among those interwar rail marketing initiatives. And it's a bit different from what some of the other railway companies were doing. And I'll talk about each of these things in a bit more detail. There's an interesting question about, was this strategy or serendipity? Did the railway plan for it to become this huge topic that it became? Did they plan for it to be what it was, or did it just come about as a result of good luck? And then why does it last so long? Endurance and equivocation. Why does it have this staying power that we're still talking about it all these years later, decades and decades after the company that created it and promoted it has ceased to exist? And it's still used today. It's still a phrase that we use and recognize. And I suggest that the flexibility of it as a concept and the way it can be applied in so many different ways is part of the reason that that's come about. So just a quick word about the coverage. When I was working on my dissertation, I found it necessary to focus my research on a very particular period. And the period that I chose was 1920 to 1939, the interwar period. So a lot of what you're going to see tonight relates to that period. However, the Riviera's history itself is longer than that. It starts around the turn of the century and it continues pretty much up to the current day. And I've put in a few things there picked up from later periods. So there's a little bit of BR publicity there, which names the Cornish Riviera from the 1950s. There's a 1972 guidebook, Nothing to Do with the Railway, which is explicitly named the Riviera. And then you still see things today like this calendar, which you can buy in various places, including on Amazon today, 2024 Cornish Riviera calendar. Nothing to do with the railway. It's just something that the calendar publisher has found useful as a way of labeling what they're representing. And again, you can see these imagery there, the beautiful blue seas, the sandy beach. You can see what's going on. And one of the things that I've had the flexibility to do, since no longer having the deadline of a dissertation to write, is to spread out my research and try and look at some different things and bring in some new ideas from the longer period. So one interesting thing about the Riviera is trying to pin down where the idea came from in the first place. Now, you'll often see it written that it was invented by the Great Western Railway, and that's true, and it's not true. They weren't the first people to use the Riviera as a title, and they weren't the only people talking about Rivieras in general. Did they invent the Cornish Riviera as we understand it? Well, possibly they did, because they were highly influential on the way we think about it today. But they didn't come up with the idea. And one of the earliest references that I traced in my research was in 1898 in the short-lived Cornish magazine, which had a long article talking about how Falmouth could be promoted as a tourist destination and might be made a kind of English Riviera, was the precise quote. And it appears in other areas as well, like the Watered Lock guides, which were big sellers around this period. describing Cornwall, saying Cornwall has been called the English Riviera. You also find it in newspaper advertisements for property and hotels and so on, talking about being on the Riviera, the English Riviera, or part of the Riviera. The railway really starts to get involved after 1904, and that's the year that they publish the Cornish Riviera guidebook. And that's really the first thing that they do. You know, the guidebook itself is actually quite revolutionary and is an immense seller. It sells 250,000 copies in its first year. And it's an evolution, really, of some earlier guidebooks published independently, but they address a different market. They address a new middle-class market with it to promote Cornwall as a holiday destination. The same year, they launch a non-stop rail service from London to Cornwall, which is not called the Cornish Riviera, is called the Plymouth, Falmouth and Penzance Limited Express. Now, you might think that they would have tied that in with publishing the Cornish Riviera guidebook, but they certainly didn't appear to make a direct connection for the benefit of consumers. However, they seem to quite quickly realise that there is an opportunity to name this train something a little catchier. So they run this competition in the railway magazine, and there are a lot of entries, out of which the then general manager James English chooses the Riviera Express, not the Cornish Riviera, the Riviera Express. Although they quite quickly change it to the Cornish Riviera Express. Then 1905, you see the one of the service elements appearing. So we get these new rolling stock brought in, these dreadnought coaches designed by Churchwood. 1906, the special service is now actually been quietly named Cornish Riviera Express, and 1906 is the first year that it runs year round rather than just in the summer. And it's also the year that the cut-off route, now known as the Bucks and Hants route, fully opens, which means you no longer have to come all the way via Plymouth. So it speeds up the route, shortens the route mileage, and means that you can just get there that bit quicker. 1907, 1908, we see the very famous Italian poster, which I'm sure many people will be familiar with on the left. One of the things that's interesting about that is that this is clearly promoting Cornwall, but the word Riviera doesn't appear anywhere on that poster. So we can also see promotion of Cornwall as a holiday destination going on, and a comparison with a Riviera-like place, but again, not using the Riviera name. So there's quite a degree of ambiguity here about what's going on. And this speaks to the strategy and serendipity question is, were they really planning this? Did they see these connections? Doesn't appear so. It feels like there's a series of different ideas coming together. And so that's the sort of prehistory, if you will. And now we can move into the section where I'll talk about some of the outcomes or findings of my research in a little more detail. So think about distinctiveness and difference, first of all. So one of the things that makes the Cornish Riviera as a campaign distinct, in my view, is that it is both a place and a product, or product or service as a product, if you will. Now, as a place, it's a distributed geography, is the phrase that I've used, rather than a specific place. It's not a particular town, it's a generalized area. And this is quite interesting. And it's also a novel destination brand. So it's something which wasn't that familiar. It's not completely invented by the railway, but it wasn't that familiar to people before. And when you look at named trains used across all the railway companies before 1940 and analyze them, you see that they split into what you can see in my pie chart there. So novel destination brands are really the smallest part of the total. The majority of them are representing recognizable destinations, either a specific town or an area. So, for example, come to Yorkshire, or the Scarborough Flyer, or what you might, there are plenty of other examples I'm sure people can think of. About a third are service brands, which are things like Bournemouth Bell and so on, where the destination is clear And what the name or what the brand is trying to do is to promote the idea of a particular service. So when you have things like the Brighton Bell or the Bournemouth Bell or the Golden Arrow, you know what that's about. It's promoting a particular quality of service rather than a particular train or a particular destination. Whereas a Cornish Riviera is something different, because it's the rail service itself, it's the destination that you're going to, and it's the idea of the holiday that you're going to have there, but it's not a specific place. It could be one of a number of different towns. And one of the pieces of commentary that one comes across is the distinction between the way that the Great Western promotes its services and the way the other grouping companies promote their services. So when you look at LNER, LMS, and Southern Railway publicity, there's often a focus on modernity and technological excellence and so on, which seems to be absent in the GWR promotion, and nowhere more so than the Riviera, which is all about this rather bucolic remote destination. But actually, there's an interesting thing going on there, which is possibly the GWR, because it had history, unlike the other railway companies. It existed before and really just assimilated a few additional parts of its network. It has this deep-standing connection with its territory. So it's able to exploit that in a way that the other railways perhaps can't. So we have something different going on with this brand than we see with some other brands. So what do we mean when we talk about Riviera? Well, the Riviera was a word that the railway could pick up on, because it's defined in the dictionary as a coastal or waterside region considered to resemble the Mediterranean Riviera. So that's a great idea to pick up on. But there is this somewhat flexible, changeable idea of what it actually represents. Sometimes it seems to stand for the entire county, other times not. On the whole, it settles on the sort of sunny, sheltered south coast. And I've picked up a few quotes there from different publications by the railway on the left-hand side that seem to suggest it's on the south side of the county, but without ever kind of completely committing to what it actually is. And it may not be entirely a coincidence, of course, that the Great Western's network was entirely on the south and west side of the county, whereas the Southern Railway had the connections to the north part of the county, which was later, of course, promoted by them as the Atlantic coast. And I've picked out from the Holiday Haunts book there, 1937, Great Western Railway publication. When you look at the map, you see they're representing, with the red box around it, the entire county of Cornwall as the Cornish Riviera. But then when you look at the section in the book that deals with it, it's got that blocky illustration that says the Cornish Riviera, but then the actual chapter title is Cornwall. So there's quite a degree of ambiguity here. What we do know about it is that it definitely has these kind of abstract qualities, and this is where we're picking up on this Riviera idea. It's the domestic exotic, if you will. I can't claim to have invented that phrase. It's used elsewhere, but it really applies very well. And it does allow this flexibility in how things are represented over time. So in the very early stages, early 1900s, there's a strong emphasis on climate, health, and pleasure. And we see a lot of stuff in the guides and the publications about how it's a winter health and pleasure resort, and you can go there for this fantastic climate. Then in the 1920s, we see more emphasis on the kind of cultural elements and the wildness and ruggedness of the landscape and the scenery that you can see, remoteness, connections to Celticity, or Celtic history, the idea that you're going there to have a different experience and do something exotic. And then in the 1930s, the emphasis changes again, and we see more, and talking more about the timelessness of the place, the idea of it being a place of escapism, or like England, but like an earlier kind of England, rather than so much focus on it being a Celtic land. And these clearly reflect different cultural threads and trends which are going on in the world in the meantime, and show how the Riviera concept can kind of be reused in different ways. What's consistently true throughout it is that Cornwall is represented as something distinctively different from the rest of the country. And there are some quotes there that I've pulled up on the right to illustrate that. The slightly fuzzy illustration, which I apologize for, shows the series of publications they produced called The Line to Legend Land, with these rather gothic illustrations of different myths and legends. And although they represent the many destinations across the Great Western Network, the majority of them actually are Cornish ideas, which partly illustrates the importance of the Riviera, but also the applicability of that idea, I think. So another way in which the Riviera is distinctive is in the way that it represents a very specific service quality. And there's also a focus, beside the focus on destination, there's the Riviera as the rail service that takes you there. So, and there's a strong effort, I think, to represent this as something outside of the ordinary. One of the things that comes up in a lot of tourism literature and research is the idea that it's important to holiday as something different from what you normally do. It's one of the defining characteristics of what makes a holiday or a break of any sort. Therefore, I think the railway is recognizing this, and they want to make the journey there part of the experience. And that's particularly important where you're asking people to make a very long, expensive journey. So, we see special rolling stock frequently renewed as a constant feature of the service. We see this strong effort to promote the idea that the service is something out of the ordinary, something special, something extra, both internally, so within outlets like the Great Western Railway magazine, where there's a series of long articles over the years promoting the quality of the service or whenever new technical innovations were introduced, and also a real effort to get that into the press and get publicity for it. And there's an article there from the Times from 1935, for example, talking about the luxury train that's available, and a report on it, which on the whole, those reports were very positive, glowing sort of reports. Everything possible is done to please and satisfy, you can see there. And there are some quite entertaining things that you'll come across around it, including the rather delightful idea of this Vita glass, which they introduce. And the idea of this is that it maximizes your exposure to UV light. It's something that might actually be quite alarming to people today, when we'd rather have tinted windows and protection from UV light, since we understand the health consequences of overexposure to UV light. What we certainly see over time is that the importance of these premium holiday services grows for the railway. The share of passenger revenue increases very substantially. It pretty much doubles during the 1920s. And you can see that the kind of numbers of seat reservations that they're dealing with per year, well over 250,000, with a big peak in the summer of many as 20,000 per day, goes to show that this becomes increasingly important for the railway. So now a little bit about the question of strategy or serendipity, which we touched on earlier. So, we can see, and that's just kind of scratching the surface, really, the things that I've been able to show you there. We see that the railway is taking quite a sophisticated approach, and there's quite a lot of layers and things going on here. There's the destination brand, there's the service quality, there's the promotion of the guidebooks. And there are plenty of other publicity materials they're producing as well, whether you want to think about, jigsaws or booklets promoting that you can follow the route when you're traveling on the service and so on. But how much was this planned? How much strategy was there behind it? And you saw from the early history that I showed that there was this rather disjointed start to it, where it didn't appear that they'd really thought it through before they started on bringing together the elements that eventually came together to form this service. So I was asking myself questions like this: to what extent did the managers really follow a strategy or have a plan for what they were doing with the Riviera? And did they really have a clear concept in their minds of what the Riviera was? Because there's certainly quite a degree of ambiguity in the material they published about it. And did they consider it to be their own thing? Did they consider it a GWR property, or did they consider it to be a description of a place that they served? And the evidence on this is equivocal. So that just makes life more interesting, doesn't it? So there is evidence that there were elements of strategy. It went on, it has a very long life, and they approached this in quite a sustained way. And although it does change gradually over time, there is quite a lot that's sustained over each year. The Riviera book, for example, they start publishing that in 1904, and it's published pretty much continuously every year. It becomes very widely recognized as a mainstay of the Great Western marketing program. And you will see that. I mentioned that when you look through the existing literature and the research that's been done elsewhere on railway marketing and tourism in general, and you will find a lot of mentions of the Riviera and other named trains in there, even though they're not always examined in their own right in detail. And it comes up all the time that the Riviera is a mainstay of the marketing program, or the most reliable, or the anchor point. So it very clearly has established a kind of preeminence. And there's really significant investment in the marketing collateral, in the rolling stock, in the book publication, and a lot of management effort goes into it. And it's a cross-organization effort. Got the publicity department, you've got the engineering department creating the improved route and engineering to support the work, the rolling stock that is able to provide this quality of service, the traffic department rostering the trains and making sure that you've got the people to run them and that they receive priority on the network. And there is evidence of them using data to measure and inform some of the decision making. Against that, we've got the disjointed way the parts come together. There is, despite all of those indications that there's some thinking going on, nowhere that I could find in the railway business records specific evidence of them actually doing planning or having a strategy. There's no statement of strategy, and there are very few quantified targets or objectives. Now, of course, that's not unusual in business thinking of the time, and it just because it isn't written down doesn't mean that it didn't exist. And one of the things that I'll move on to the next slide, that we find it, other historians, other researchers have found, and you'll see similar comments by people who've written about other aspects of railway history, that they found similar things, that there's lots of the publicity material to be found, but it becomes a bit harder when you're trying to trace that internal story. So, however, having said that, there is evidence that they were thinking about this, and that the management was interested in it. So Sir Felix Pole is an example of one of the managers who was fairly pivotal, I think, in driving this forward. The interesting thing about Pole was that he had made his name really around promoting the editorial content in the Great Western Railway magazine. So he was a person who was particularly interested in publicity, and he talks a lot about publicity in his memoir. And I've given a quote for him there, pointing out that one of his predecessors as general manager, Sir James English, recognised that developing passenger traffic, advertising and publicity methods must be introduced. So there's good evidence that the leadership of the company was serious about promoting this and kind of gave space for people to do it and invested in it. The second panel there, the internal story. So we see that Maxwell Fraser, who was the publicity manager in March 1930, writes some long pieces in the Great Western Railway magazine, and you see an extract from that illustrated there, talking about how much effort goes into producing some of the publicity materials that the railway publishes, and saying it takes a year to produce holiday haunts. There's a large staff of people working on these things year round. So there's a major investment consistently year to year. There's a few interesting nuggets that you can find. So you know, under related declarations there, I've got an example of minutes from the Railway Students Association, which are in the National Archives. And Mr. Orton, who was a former head of the publicity department, made a speech to them where he talked quite a lot about what was done in the publicity department and how they went about deciding what to spend their money on, what to invest in. And he says a series of interesting things in there, like it is the duty of the publicity officer to decide what expenditure will give the best results. So that does suggest that the railway is not just spending its money randomly or spending its money on the same thing year after year, but is actually thinking about what they believe is going to deliver the best business results for the company. And then you find other interesting things. So the publicity officer attends these superintendents meetings of the railway, and occasionally you get something in the minutes that suggests things that they're talking about. And there's a complaint, for example, in this meeting in October 1936, where the complaint is made that the sale of the holiday guides is highly disproportionate in some places from other places. And the suspicion arises that this depends on how active the staff are in promoting it. And you can kind of imagine what they're thinking of here is that, you know, some people make the effort and put the guides out and talk to customers about them, and some people don't. And they're saying this is the backbone of publicity. You know, this is important stuff. And they're looking at statistics that show what the sales, even to the extent of showing what the sales of the holiday guides are, books like the Riviera and Holiday Haunts, are at different stations, and they have an expectation of what they ought to be based on the traffic volumes and the number of people at those stations. So this shows some fairly sophisticated thinking. Other topics here, some things around what we see in the management behaviors, even though they may not really be declaring what they're doing, we can see that they're thinking about their marketing in quite sophisticated ways. And I'm highlighting some of the findings of other researchers there, like Alan Bennett, who discovered these, or talks about designated roles for different destinations. So he talks about the railway allocating particular characters in the way it represents different regions, whether it be Cornwall or Southern Ireland or Devon. We see things like the idea of glorious Devon and the Cornish Riviera, and so on. So they're allocating particular characteristics to different destinations. And the marked heterogeneity in their promotional style and presentation. And that's reflected in the kind of photographs and image making that you see for the different areas. And as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, we do see this evolution over time from the 1910s, this kind of health and pleasure resort idea, domestic exotic in the 1920s, and this timelessness in the 30s. There are different publications that target particular customer groups. So there's an effort to kind of segment the customer group. There's a publication publications like the Wildlife Guides, this little booklet, Cornwall and its Wildlife, that's produced, clearly aimed at people who are interested in bird watching and other aspects of the wildlife. The 1030 Limited books, which are for boys of all ages, which describe the technical running of the train. So that's part of this Riviera as a holistic experience. Talk about the locomotives and the operation of the train and all sorts of exciting technical details. And then there are Through the Window books, which are for the more casual traveller who's interested in the landscape they're moving through and trying to make the journey part of the experience. So it's a holistic selling of the whole holiday. And there's definitely this evidence on staff education and customer service. We saw the idea of the holiday guides and promotion. One of the other things that Auden talks about in his lecture to the Railway Students Association is the idea that it's important for the staff delivering service, the restaurant car staff, the platform staff, the porters, all of these people to be thinking about customer service and give people a good experience, so that when they travel on the train, they get the brand experience that's been sold to them. And we absolutely see a multi-channel approach, what we would call in modern marketing a multi-channel approach. So there's press publicity, there are posters, There's this media relations, definitely, really active attempt to place stories in the press. There's engagement with the local chambers of commerce to coordinate activity with local business people, the people who are running the hotels and the local service businesses that people are using when they arrive at the holiday. And we see a willingness to be quite innovative in the use of posters, photography, postcards, jigsaws, handy guides, commissioning artworks. There were illuminated artworks at Paddington in the 1930s. So quite, albeit that some of the publications are, or the representation may be conservative in the Great Western oeuvre, a lot of the techniques they're using are quite sophisticated behind the scenes. So another thing that we see here is this ability to assimilate existing ideas. So we've thought about how this Riviera idea pre-existed. The Riviera guidebook, when it comes out, it follows this fairly well-established guidebook structure with the division of the county into different chapters dealing with different sections and how you might travel around the county. But the way it's represented is quite different from earlier guides. So it's written in a much breezier style, not quite so serious-minded and more reserved. It's obviously trying to appeal to a slightly more casual, more middle-class clientele, the kind of people who want to travel by rail rather than the intrepid travellers of the early Edwardian period, for whom it would have been a bigger deal to come down to Cornwall. And the use of some of these classic signs and symbols in a lot of the representations. The palm trees, which I mentioned before, there's a pen and ink illustration there showing that they've shoehorned in another palm tree there to just emphasize this subtropical climate idea, and the ability to feed off this artist promotion of the area as well. Stanhope Forbes was one of the preeminent artists of the Newlyn School, and there's one of the more famous paintings that he produced, which was actually commissioned by the Great Western Railway. The original belongs to the National Railway Museum, and he was already well known and depicting Cornwall in ways that were convenient to the Great Western Railway. So there's definitely a connection being made there. And by connecting themselves with the artists, they're also establishing a kind of sophistication or a kind of messaging about the sort of sophisticated experience that you can have, and linking into these different cultural ideas. Having said that, this is, a highly selective depiction of Cornish life and activities. We see a lot of the coastline, we see beautiful sunshine, we see the sandy seas. We don't see other aspects of Cornish identity and history around, say, the mining and industrial heritage, which is something that you don't see so much of on the coast, but which is an important part, of course, of Cornish history. Okay. So moving on to endurance and equivocation. So this question about whether the flexibility of the concept explains its persistence, and how there are some equivocal attitudes, I think, to whether or not this is an accepted representation of what Cornwall should represent. And I touched on that a little bit just at the end of the previous section, where we started to think about the mining heritage of Cornwall and whether this is actually an accurate representation of what the county is. And when you look at some of the more recent scholarship, especially Cornish history, there is a lot of highly critical approaches to the Riviera as a really rather unhelpful myth-making in some people's view. And it talks about it along with, to be fair, not only the Great Western Railway, but other approaches, an outsider's view of the county, something that's kind of been imposed on Cornwall and Cornish people. There's a dislike of the way some of the commentary trivializes the place for casual tourist consumption. It certainly, the Riviera representation certainly ignores major elements of local identity. We see very few inland landscapes. We don't see anything about the mining and industrial achievements of the county. And we've got to remember that for local people, the railway has a slightly more ambiguous role, where it's not just a way that you get to go on a wonderful sunny holiday for 2 weeks of the year, which is probably one of the highlights of your year. It's also something which potentially represents economic threat, and was also a way in which a lot of people who were affected by the mining crisis in the county left, some of them for good. So it becomes a symbol of other things than just delightful holidays and sunshine. And I put some of the kind of bombshell quotes in on the left there, which can be which you can take. One of my favorites there is that you could think of the Riviera presentation as a sanitized Disney-esque Kerno land, shrink-wrapped, preserved, and furnished with fudge. So on the right-hand side of the screen now, I'm highlighting some elements which point out that there is some criticism, albeit not necessarily quite so strong in many cases, from contemporary commentators outside of the GWR's ambit. And some of the independent guidebooks kind of reformulate the idea of the Riviera or actively disclaim it. Local influencers tend to be skeptical, so the great and the good of the area. You see various comments in newspaper articles and letters to newspapers and so on, complaining about the railway's representation. And there is this sense that the Riviera is something that the GWR is kind of promoting, and it's not necessarily something that belongs to local people. And quite entertainingly, a thing which I recently found in the Bradshaw's Railway Handbook of 1863 was this quote that says, "Cornwall is one of the least inviting of the English counties, bare, rugged hills, bleak moors, and it exhibits the appearance of a dreary waste. The most important objects are its numerous mines." And this is just at the point that Cornish mining is going into serious decline. So it's interesting that 50 years or so before the Riviera idea really takes off, the prevailing idea of the county is that it's bleak and deeply unattractive. And then you see one or two quotes there from some of the local advertisers' alternative. Arthur Quillercouch being one of the local luminaries, saying it's not an English Riviera and never will be. And that from the man that invented the phrase delectable duchy. Some more evidence on this comes out when we start to look at some of the meetings of local councils and so on. And were local associations and councils interested in promoting the county or promoting their area? Great Western Railway quite often tries to do joint actions with local chambers of commerce or local authorities on promoting their area, get them to contribute to the cost of publicity, advertising, posters, advertisements, publicity tours. And there's a distinct degree of equivocation about how much they're involved. In fact, the Penzance Town Council in the records that I was able to look at seemed to be pretty lukewarm about promoting their area to tourists at all. There are lots of these minutes repeatedly, month after month after month, year after year, where they receive various requests for action, like number 8 there in the box. Several applications received for reversement, but no action was taken, and they just do nothing. They effectively very passive. They do participate in one or two campaigns, but generally quite reluctantly and only reactively. Interestingly, however, the Great Western is pretty much the most frequently cited correspondent that the advertising committee has. So the railway is constantly trying to engage with people consistently over a period of time, but not necessarily making a great deal of impact. Similar story when you look at Falmouth. And there's some entertaining commentary from the West Briton Cornwall Advertiser, one of the more serious local newspapers, about this idea of whether Falmouth should be promoting itself as a holiday destination. And they use this phrase "booming the Riviera," which was seems to have been a way of talking about promoting it or puffing it. And there's some rather contradictory elements come out in the debate here, where Falmouth is invited to contribute to this publicity scheme with the Great Western Railway, but the advertising committee is pretty equivocal about whether or not they want to, and some people say that they aren't really very keen on promoting the idea of the Riviera if it's promoting the whole of the Riviera, and they think Falmouth actually ought to get special prominence rather than just contributing to a generalized Riviera campaign. See this distributed geography issue going on again, and some rivalry between the local places. Then you get another comment further on where somebody else says, why should Falmouth contribute if other towns aren't contributing, which is somewhat contradictory to, well, if we contribute, we should get special prominence. In any case, it's not clear whether they ever actually do anything about this. Chamber of Commerce, as you might expect, is a bit more receptive, representing obviously the local businesses, and maybe some hoteliers in there. They're a little bit more willing to help out. And this is a story that gets repeated. One example, there's quite a number of repeats of this which you can find. So moving outside of my key time period, one of the interesting things is that these ideas of the GWR and the GWR's representation of the brand are still today, in the present era, really the kind of touch point or the reference point. And this is one of the things that I find really interesting about the strength of this as an idea. So I've taken an extract from Spectator magazine from January 2023. That's an excerpt from an article which is actually about a rather avant-garde film made in Cornwall, nothing to do with the railway, but the writer Tanya Gold there is calling out that to most visitors, Cornwall is as simple as the GWR posters, gaudy pastels, happy children, ice cream. This Cornwall exists for 6 weeks in the summer holidays, setting for a visitor's bourgeois childhood, but it's not the essential one. So she's making pretty much that same point. Okay, she doesn't name the Riviera, but those are clearly the same tropes and ideas that we see in the Riviera. She's saying, okay, that's the GWR's view, not our view. And then on the right-hand side, you've got a rather good summary, a recently published book, travel book on the county, and he identifies in that 2 brand names for the tourist industry: Gwilla Couch's Delectable Duchy and the Cornish Riviera. So representing the Riviera as one of the two brand names that were created for the industry, and obviously the Riviera, I would suggest, is the one that's endured the best, and that's probably something to do with the way the railway has wrapped it up and made it all part of our consciousness. But it's interesting that is still being attributed to the Great Western Railway today. And there are interesting other examples of how some of these icons reappear. So there's a couple of examples here of a network rail competition that they ran during the COVID time, talking about the importance of art and artistic representations of the coastline. And this was a campaign that they ran to get people interested in travel again after the lockdowns, I think, and try and keep people interested in where to go. And they asked people to submit images of places that they hadn't been able to travel to and would then like to. And it was interesting that we see places like St Michael's Mount and sandy Cornish beaches appearing there. And Sir Peter Hendy's quote, that's from a press release in 2021, talking about using art to promote destination and explicitly making that connection. This art is going to become part of history. So seeing it, he's clearly seeing this in a continuum, a historical continuum. And then you see this Riviera idea still a source up until the present day. theorists and publicity materials from within the last 20 years or so. 2006, there's a holiday guidebook published by Cornwall Council, which is now defunct district council representing a mid-Cornwall area. And again, it's interesting to see they're representing the Riviera there. You can see it's in the little map that they've got in the middle there. It's clearly indicating this south coast region, and they're trying to position the Riviera as being their area specifically. So again, trying to take ownership of this idea. There's a postcard here. That's a 1980 postcard talking about the Cornish Riviera. And again, you've got this kind of slightly Gothic representation of it. But this now looks like the whole county. So again, you've got the same kind of ambiguities there. And then here's a slide just pulling together various things using the Riviera idea over time. Independently published touring map, the Cornish Riviera, that's 1912. There's this book of caricatures, which is really nothing to do with the railway at all. This is published by this chap, Fitzherbert, and it represents local luminaries in a slightly satirical way, series of satirical cartoons, really. And he's chosen the Riviera as a appropriate description for that. There's the 1972 book. We saw the cover of that earlier. And some text from that: holiday in England's most westerly county, many ways like a visit to another country. So again, you still got that idea in the 1970s of this otherness, that you're going somewhere completely different. 1949, this is a little guidebook to the Cornish Riviera, trying to represent it as Penzance. So another area laying claim to it. There's your image of St Michael's Mount that we see time and time again. And in every essential, Cornwall is not England. Cornishmen are quite different in temperament, Celtic characteristics, this idea of otherness again. And I found it quite interesting to see that illustration of a horse-drawn plough. Remember, this is 1949. Other places we've got images of extreme modernity being used at this stage. But here, what have we got? We've got something harking back to a timeless history, familiar age. So that is where I'm going to stop. I think I've used probably about as much time as I ought to before we give people a chance for discussion and questions. So I hope that's been interesting and touched on a few themes and a few nuggets of things that I've discovered and found interesting over the years.